thanks for coming. For those that don't know me, I'm John Rash. I am a assistant professor of Southern Studies and Film Production, which means I'm joint appointed in the Theater and Film Department and Southern Studies. And I'm one of the co-directors of the film Our Movement Starts Here, which features some of the photos that we're going to talk about today. Melanie Ho, who's sitting in the front, is the other co-producer, co-director, if you know Melanie. So 12 years ago, I sat in a classroom at Duke University's Center for Documentary Studies thinking about the projects that I was going to create as a student. At the time, I was sort of concerned with my projects, obviously, sort of thinking forward about what I was going to do in my program, how I was going to grow as an artist, not really taking the time to think about the numerous students who came before me at that place, at that institution, and the undoubtedly amazing projects that they had created along the way. And one of those students was Jenny Labalme, who's here with us today. At one point, she sat in the Center for Documentary Studies and had a photo class and decided to document a protest that was happening an hour away in Warren County. And as an educator who's done this for a while, I can say that in and of itself was an achievement, because it's hard for me to get my students to go beyond the gates of this campus sometimes for their projects, or beyond the Oxford Square. So for Jenny to go an hour away continuously throughout the semester to document those protests shows the commitment that she had, shows that she recognized the importance of what was happening there. And I think that it was that commitment that really led to her creating the body of work that she's going to talk about today, that essentially documented a landmark historical event. It also led to her forging a relationship with the community in Warren County that has only grown over the years and led to us meeting in North Carolina in 2022 when we were working on the film, and led to her being here with us today. So I'm really honored to introduce Jenny Labalme today and to talk about the exhibit in the gallery. Jenny spent almost 2 decades working as a photojournalist and later as a journalist for publications in North Carolina, Alabama, Mexico City, and Indianapolis. Her protest photos have appeared in the Washington Post, the Museum of Modern Art, the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum, the Wilson Library at the University of North Carolina, and in numerous books, scholarly articles, and in our film, Our Movement Starts Here, which many of you, I hope, saw here at the university last month. So let's give Jenny Labalme a warm welcome and thank her for being here today.
Thank you, John, for that nice introduction. And I also want to thank the Center for the Study of Southern Culture here and Apton Thomas for coordinating my visit. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I have roughly 20 photos in this exhibit. And in the exhibit at UNC, I had about 40. This is a smaller version of the UNC exhibit. So probably the best way to start my discussion on this is to give you a little history about what happened in Warren County and how I came to be involved in photographing it. So this started as a criminal act, and in the summer of 1978, in order to avoid the high fees of disposing of polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, a North Carolina-based transformer company and some other characters participated in a classic case of midnight dumping. And they drove a truck around 240 miles of North Carolina roadways in 14 counties and sprayed an oily, goopy film of toxic PCBs by the shoulder of the roads. And PCB is a known carcinogen, and it was used to insulate electrical transformers. And residents along the spills started complaining about nausea, burning eyes, and dizziness from the black waste. This is how North Carolina officials became aware of this spill. It was one of the largest illegal and intentional toxic waste spills in the nation. So now the state of North Carolina had to deal with a major public health threat. And in 1978, after looking at approximately 90 sites around North Carolina in 20 counties, they picked Warren County, which at the time was predominantly rural, low income, sparsely populated, and Black. So Warren County residents found out about this by reading about it in the local paper 5 days before Christmas. And within days, a loose coalition of citizens organized and started meeting. And in the beginning, this was made up of a handful of white citizens, a handful of Black citizens, that included the local head of the NAACP, a funeral home director, several nearby Black ministers, and some white hunters and farmers. So for 4 years, between 1978 and 1982, this multiracial grassroots coalition of local citizens mobilized to fight the dump site in every way they could think of. So they spoke out at public hearings, they wrote letters to the editor, they filed numerous lawsuits, they even met with the North Carolina governor, James B. Hunt, they contacted their elected representatives, and they brought in their own experts, including soil scientists who declared that the site was unsafe. Also during this 4-year time period, EPA waived 2 of its own landfill regulations. So one of them was that the bottom of a landfill was supposed to be 50 feet above the groundwater. In Warren County, it was only 7 feet away. They waived that regulation. Landfills also had to be above area where there was something called clay pans, and soil samples showed there was no clay in the soil, and it was also soil that was highly permeable. Even so, and it says so in this exhibit, state officials called it the Cadillac of landfills, and back then a Cadillac was considered a top luxury car. Warren County residents continued to argue that the landfill was sited because they were politically weak, because the area around the landfill was 75% Black, and because Warren County ranked 97th in per capita income out of 100 North Carolina counties. So what is Warren County like? I was talking to a few students before we came in here, and since the Center for the Study of Southern Culture is looking at Southern environments this year, the natural world, and its history, I want to paint a picture of Warren County for you. So Warren County is vast. It is 428 square miles. It's a trapezoid-shaped county right below the Virginia border. It's sparsely populated. In the 1980s, there were just 16,000 residents, all of whom were classified by the census in 1980 as rural residents. It's full of streams, natural springs, and wildlife that residents hunt. And it's relatively flat, but the land also undulates. People there are deeply connected to the land and the soil and the earth. Residents there are also exceptionally religious. And in 1982, almost everyone attended their local church on Sunday. Also, almost everyone had a family garden and knew local farmers. And in 1982, as is the same today, if you drive through downtown Warrenton, which is the county seat, it's really quite picturesque. There are barber shops, some eateries, and clothing stores on the main street. And then on many side streets are beautiful antebellum homes. The county's rural population is mainly made up of African Americans, many of whose ancestors had been slaves. And many Blacks in that area became sharecroppers or tenant farmers on what had been white plantations. Many Blacks in the area also inherited their last names from white plantation owners. And there are also Native Americans who have lived in Warren County for years. And then the crops that were farmed there were tobacco, soybeans, cotton, cucumbers, and some people raised cattle. So when you drive through rural parts of Warren County, you will see a lot of loblolly pines, fields with neat rows of crops, weathered tobacco barns, and small churches and abandoned old neighborhood grocery stores and supply stores. Okay, so let's return to the protests that began on September 15th, 1982. So when citizens had exhausted all their legal battles, they turned to protest and civil disobedience as a final option. So what set the groundwork for what became a grassroots, multiracial, and peaceful protest? Warren County is an extremely close-knit community. A lot of people there have lived there for generations and are related. Everyone looked out for his or her neighbor. There's a strong network of Black churches. And just the way Black churches played a critical role in the civil rights movement, so did they play a critical role in the Warren County PCB protest. Like the civil rights movement, Black churches served as places for meetings and rallies, and Black preachers in the community were the bedrock of spiritual, emotional, and moral support. There was also a strong network of white churches, and like Black ministers, white ministers were highly respected. People in Warren County, as the exhibit mentions, also had links to several important civil rights organizations. And those included Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, and that's it. So, as you can see, in 1982, there was a marriage of civil rights and environmental concerns that is now called the environmental justice movement. So how did I get involved? I was a 22-year-old full-time student at Duke University, and a good friend of mine was editing a weekly student publication. And he was going up to cover the protests, and he needed a photographer, so he asked me to come along. So I'd never covered a protest, and neither had my friend. And I was a self-taught photographer. I had a standard Pentax with a 50-millimeter lens and a very cheap telephoto lens that I could put on the camera. There were no self-focus cameras back then, so some of my pictures are out of focus. And then I also had to develop my own film, and I was not very good at that either, so I ruined some negatives in the developing process. So what was the first day like? I was not there the first day of the protests, but I went up, I think on a Sunday, if I remember, and everybody met at Coley Springs Baptist Church at the beginning, which was 2 miles from the landfill. And my friend and I went into the church, and it was overflowing with people. The aisles were packed, and I made my way up to a balcony in the back. And what I remember about that day was it was really hot. I don't like heat. It was really hot and humid. And I remember my face slipping on the back of the camera. And I remember everybody just being very close together. And then the other thing that I really remember from that first day were the songs. And the power of songs really moves me. And so they really touched me in a way that I think helped kind of guided me when we left the church, because people spilled out of the church and then marched 2 miles down to the landfill. So now I'm outside the church, and I just started taking pictures. So there's a saying in journalism that goes like this, which you may have heard, which is, get out of the way and let the story tell itself. I was not familiar with that expression at the time, but that's exactly what I did with my photos. So my photos, I feel, captured people praying, their anger, their fear, their resolve, their arrests, and one of the tactics they used, which was to go limp, and that was to make it a little more difficult. They weren't resisting arrest, but the police officers and the state troopers had to carry them to the jail bus. So that meant more of a delay in the trucks carrying the tainted soil to the landfill. So did I know what I was witnessing? I knew about the civil rights movement, but I hadn't studied it. And I knew when I was up there photographing the protest that I really was witnessing something extraordinary. I cannot say that what I saw then was the foundational event for what later became the environmental justice movement. And in the long career I had as a journalist, this has been one of the most important events I've covered. Plus, it has staying power, and photos have staying power. So mainly, it was the photos that immortalized the protest. And I still, over the course of 42 years, I've received requests to have my photos republished again and again. So what worked to my advantage when I was there? I was young, I was inexperienced, I didn't have a media ID, I didn't know where to stand. I think my youth at the time, I was the age of many of you here in the audience. I was also not a jaded photographer or journalist. I had no preconceived notion of what a protest was, what rural North Carolina was like, or the inner workings of a Black Baptist church. And I was able to blend in with some of the younger participants in the protest. I'm also a woman, and I'm not very big, so I'm not threatening. So why did I take so many photos in Warren County? Well, at the time, I had enrolled for fun and on a whim in a documentary photography class. It was my last semester at Duke, and I thought, this will be a fun way to kind of end my career at Duke. And I had no topic. The purpose of the class was to photograph a community and spend time in it. And after that first day in Warren County, when I went up with my friend who went on to become a longtime journalist, I knew I had to photograph this community and this protest. I couldn't be there every day because I was a full-time student, but I went up when I could. And I shot about 650 photos. Obviously, not all of them are top quality, but at the time, you couldn't delete the way you can on your smartphone or with digital cameras. There were times also when I was the only photographer up there, and there was no internet back in the 1980s. I published a small booklet, which is on the exhibit there, and that was a way to leave a historical record in the community because I felt it was important for people not to forget what they did. So why do I feel like my photos and some of the others in this exhibit that I did not take have staying power? Well, I think it shows a David versus Goliath situation. You have these large Department of Transportation dump trucks, and then you have small children who are lying in the road blocking them. It's also about the power of the government versus the powerlessness of a small group of citizens. And then for those of you who are studying photography or film, there's the power of the visual image. And I think all of us know how photos can evoke very deep emotions in all of us. And it's cliche, but all of you know the expression, a photo is worth 1,000 words. So when you think of the photos coming out of North Carolina now from Hurricane Helene or Hurricane Milton, they're pretty dramatic and stark, and they stay with you. And I think some of the photos from this protest have had the same effect. So part of the reason that these photos have spoken to people is they give audiences a window into a moment in history. So anyway, I think now's a chance to open it up for questions, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone has. She asked if these questions are considered a major part of my life and my work? I would say yes. I mean, when I was there, as I said earlier, I knew I was witnessing something very important, but it didn't, and there were a lot of national media that came and local media, but it didn't garner the attention or anchor itself in history the way it has, because time has passed and people can look back on what happened. So I think now with the advent of the internet, and I have a website with these photos on it so people can see them, and I'm all about access. So I think it's important for people to know these stories and other ones in Southern environments, which you study here. But also, to answer your question a little more, I mean, I was a journalist for many, many years, and every story I covered was important, but nothing I covered has had the staying power that this story has. And I was writing a lot of stories. People don't call me and say, oh, can I reprint your story? They're not that interested in what I wrote. They're really interested in the visuals. And I think also because it was in black and white, I mean, when I watch John's film and I see some of the footage in color, I'm like, oh, I don't remember that that's what that person was wearing. I mean, it's kind of jarring to me because I still see the protest in black and white.
Jenny, could you talk about your engagements with the community after the protests were over? I know that you're very involved with them now, but even the period in between, like, when did you go back? How often did you talk to folks over those 42 years?
Well, initially, so what happened is I graduated in December of 1982, and I had, there was a history professor at Duke, a couple of professors who'd seen my work, and they said, you really should write a book. Well, I didn't know the first thing about writing a book, and of course, there was no internet then. I didn't know how to raise money. I tried to raise money. People said, this is too controversial. And then they used the word too political. I'm not sure what was political about it. But anyway, so I started going back up in 1983 and doing oral histories. So I bought the cheapest tape recorder I could find and the cheapest cassette tapes, and I went back up there. And the songs that I taped were not during the protest because I was so busy photographing it, but it was in those songs that you heard in the show, in the video, were taped in 1983. So, but I went back and I got to know a lot of people quite well, and a lot of people remembered me from when I was there during the 6-week protest. But I went back up and then I published this small booklet, and I think that helped. But I was doing interviews, and again, I was not a journalist then. I didn't really know how to ask questions, and I wasn't really sure what I was after because the protest was so new, and it's very different now going back. So for the 40th, I hadn't been back in 35 years, and that was quite emotional for me because I met some of the people in the photos who were children at the time. And I mentioned this in the class I spoke to this afternoon. We were marching down to the landfill, and again, I'm seeing everything in color as I'm going, and this lovely woman who's like a gazelle came up and linked arms with me, and I just got chills, and I had no idea who she was. And she had seen me because I'd been up on stage, but it turned out she was one of the young children. She was maybe 12 or 11 at the time, who is lying in the road. It's probably the most reproduced photo of mine, with the trucks in the background coming down, and then you see some police and you see some people lying in the road. So that was very emotional, and I've since been going back there and talking to people, but it was hard to keep in touch because there were no cell phones then, and so the only way for me to keep in touch with people was by letter or a long distance phone call, which you didn't want to make because those were expensive. So I reconnected with Dolly Burwell, who spoke here when John and Melanie screened their film, when we both discovered we were on Facebook. So she and I have reconnected that way. And I have to say, that's one of the pluses of social media, was reconnecting with her. And I've become friends on Facebook with some other people. But I think when I've been on several panels now in North Carolina, I was on one in DC, and there's a real bond now between all of us. I mean, I didn't protest, I did not get arrested, but I was there. And so you feel this connection with the people and the community, and I really care a lot about Warren County. Yeah?
Today in class we were talking about giving agency to the people we're depicting in our photographs. And this is kind of a funny case because these people are literally being detained. So I'm just wondering, how were you thinking that, especially as a student? Like, did you feel any qualms about photographing people in the act of civil disobedience? Did you think about the political context of it?
I didn't really think about the political context of it, but I know now, because I was a journalist for years, that we were on a public road, so you can photograph people. And people didn't really know I was there when I was taking some of these. There are a few where they're looking at me, but they were so busy protesting or lying down in the road that I don't think they really knew what I was doing or focused on me and some of the other media that were there. And that was kind of a nice blessing as a photographer, even though I was not a very skilled photographer at the time. But, and I think what's so important when you're photographing people is respecting their dignity too. So, and I don't feel like any of the photos I took, at least no one has come up to me, and I certainly hope if they felt like I took a picture of them that they didn't like, that they would tell me, but no one's ever come up to me and said, oh, you kind of violated my personal space, or that's just not something I would want to be in a photo. Well, thank you all very much for coming tonight. And for those of you who are students, I hope you don't have to wait 40 years for some of your work to be recognized, but I think this is a lesson too, that sometimes it takes time for something to percolate and for people to realize the importance of something. And it's nice. I'm very happy for the community in Warren County that they are getting some of the recognition they deserve. I would like to see some reparations. I'd like to see some health tests done on them. I feel like there's still stuff that needs to be done in that community. It's still pretty isolated and pretty rural and pretty low income. So John and I continue to be involved with some of the people there. It's a wonderful community, and it has a very special place in my heart. So thank you all very much for having me this evening.
Thank you so much.